Traoré recovers Africa's gold from the West. And everything changes. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. In the heart of Ouagadougou, under the relentless Sahel sun, President Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly at his desk, staring at a grainy satellite image of a convoy leaving an airstrip in Switzerland. His jaw tightened. The convoy carried something most believed was gone forever: gold. Not just any gold, but Africa's stolen legacy, shipped off in the dead of night over decades under the guise of economic agreements. Since the colonial era, tons of African gold had quietly filled European vaults, while African children played barefoot near empty mines. But Traoré was no ordinary president. He had seen war, betrayal, and the games of empires, and he was ready to change the rules. Just hours earlier, a young intelligence officer had burst into the presidential command room holding a flash drive. On it, leaked documents from an anonymous European banker detailing the planned transfer of 22 tons of Burkinabe gold to a secret location in Belgium. It was the final shipment in a deal signed long ago by a corrupt ex-president, one whose signature still bled African dignity. As the president examined the files, a silence fell over the room. This wasn't just gold. This was history, identity, sovereignty. "Prepare Falcon Unit," Traoré said at last, his voice low but firm. "We move before they do." Later that evening, surrounded by the low hum of military drones and encrypted radios, Traoré met with General Mehdi Coulibaly, head of Burkina Faso's elite strategic operations. "They'll never let you take it back, not without a fight," Coulibaly warned. "Let them try," Traoré replied. "We're not stealing. We're retrieving what is ours." His eyes burned with conviction. For years, Africa had watched its riches build empires across oceans. Now, for the first time in modern history, a sitting African leader would attempt to reverse the tide, not with diplomatic pleading, but with precision, force, and moral clarity. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou were unaware of the storm about to unfold. Children still played soccer on dusty lots, elders debated politics at tea stalls, and vendors shouted prices over the honking chaos of motorbikes. But far above, in the war room hidden beneath the presidential palace, a new Africa was being drawn on an invisible map, and in the center of it stood one man, not as a ruler, but as a symbol of defiance. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just planning a mission. He was rewriting the legacy of a continent. Word of the gold operation had to remain tightly contained. Traoré trusted only a handful, most of them former revolutionaries or loyal officers who had bled beside him on the battlefield. At the heart of the group was Awa Diarra, a brilliant economist turned intelligence strategist. She had once worked within the Central Bank of West African states but resigned in protest when she discovered that over 80% of the region's reserves were still guaranteed by the French treasury. Now, she stood by Traoré, reviewing flight logs, asset trails, and historical treaties forged under colonial coercion. "They never thought we'd look back," she said, fingers flying across a keyboard. "But we have. And what we see is theft dressed as partnership." The data confirmed their worst fears. Burkina Faso's gold wasn't just in Belgium, it was scattered across multiple banks under dummy corporations, routed through shell accounts in Luxembourg and Zurich. One name kept recurring: Roland Devereux, a powerful financier and advisor to the European Economic Council, known in private circles as the custodian. Devereux had built his empire by managing the very funds African leaders had been forced to offshore. For Traoré, he was more than an adversary. He was the symbol of a global system that polished its chains before tightening them. Traoré's objective became clear: expose the network, freeze the assets, and bring the gold home, not just to Burkina Faso, but to all of Africa. But time was not on their side. A diplomatic storm was already forming. The French ambassador had requested an urgent audience. The IMF sent a veiled letter of concern regarding recent economic disruptions. Even the African Union, split between loyalty and fear, urged restraint. Traoré read their messages in silence, then set them aside. Let them speak of stability while we starve, he said. The only thing unstable is our submission. Awa nodded. We'll need allies who've suffered the same theft. That night, encrypted calls were made to Bamako, Conakry, Niamey, and Khartoum. The plan was no longer just about gold, it was about liberation. For the first time in decades, African nations would act not as fractured post-colonies, but as one. Meanwhile, in Brussels, Roland Devereux received an alert on his secure line. He had underestimated Traoré. The African president had mobilized faster than expected. He stared at the screen showing Falcon units' movement. So, the young lion thinks he can bite the hand that fed him, Devereux muttered. We'll see how far he gets. Behind him, his legal team began reviewing asset protections and sovereign immunity loopholes. He knew Africa had the right to demand its wealth back, but he also knew that power had never bowed to justice willingly. And as he lit a cigar in his high-rise office, he whispered to himself, "They may rise, but I built the floor they're standing on." The operation moved into its most delicate phase. Traoré authorized Falcon Unit to quietly deploy assets in key European cities, not for violence, but for surveillance and diplomacy with teeth. Meanwhile, Awa Diarra prepared a public dossier, a bombshell report connecting European banks to stolen African resources through meticulously documented transfers, contracts, and shadow deals. We won't just take the gold, she said, we'll expose the machine that took it. Traoré was silent, watching footage of a Burkinabe child dipping empty hands into a dry riverbed where gold used to run. This isn't about revenge, he finally said. It's about ending the cycle. Then came the moment that changed everything, the leak. Somehow, one of the confidential documents from Traoré's intelligence team surfaced on an independent Pan-African news channel. Within hours, headlines swept across the continent. Billions in African gold held in European vaults. President Traoré plans mass retrieval. The reaction was electric. Across Africa, young people took to social media, rallying around hashtags like #BringBackOurGold and #AfricaRises. In Senegal, students held protests outside French consulates. In Mali, murals of Traoré began appearing overnight, depicting him as a golden lion breaking chains. What began as a classified mission had now become a movement. The West responded quickly. The French government denied any wrongdoing and warned that provocative actions could destabilize the global financial order. The European Central Bank issued a statement emphasizing the importance of respecting long-standing agreements. The IMF froze scheduled support packages for several West African nations. It was economic warfare in slow motion, pressure applied through spreadsheets, not soldiers. But Traoré, used to real battlefields, remained undeterred. Let them come, he told his cabinet. If they starve us for reclaiming our blood, let history judge who the thieves are. Inside the presidential compound, the mood was tense but electric. Journalists from across Africa requested interviews, while emissaries from sympathetic nations quietly arrived in unmarked vehicles. In one room, Awa gathered a team of young economists to simulate the effects of gold repatriation. In another, engineers prepared a vault beneath the national treasury. And in a quiet chapel built during colonization, Traoré knelt in silence. Not to pray for victory, but for Africa to finally believe it deserved one. The world was watching now, and the next step could not be undone. 3 days later, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world. Flanked by African flags and backed by centuries of unspoken pain, he addressed a live international broadcast from Ouagadougou's National Assembly Hall. The hall was packed, but silent. Cameras from Al Jazeera, Africa News, and even CNN streamed the event in real time. Traoré's voice was calm but thunderous. What was stolen will be returned. What was hidden will be seen. And what was forgotten will be remembered by every child born under our sun. Then came the moment that shocked global markets. He named every bank, every account, every corporation involved in the decades-long siphoning of Africa's gold. The reaction was immediate. European stock markets trembled. Gold prices surged. Embassies across West Africa activated security protocols. But inside Burkina Faso, there was celebration. From small villages to city centers, people flooded the streets with drums and chants, waving national flags and signs that read, "We are no longer property." Children born that day would carry names like Liberty, Traoré, and Wenda, the Mossi word for sunrise. In Accra, Dakar, and Kinshasa, presidents released cautious statements in support of Traoré, some publicly, others behind closed doors. The African Union called for an emergency summit. History was breaking loose, and no one could predict where it would land. Yet not all stood behind Traoré. Some leaders, bound by dependence on Western aid, denounced his actions as reckless nationalism. Whispers of a coalition to censure Burkina Faso circulated. A confidential message reached Traoré's office, an invitation to negotiate quietly with Devereux in Geneva. It was veiled as diplomacy, but everyone in the room knew it was a trap. "They're afraid," Awa whispered. "Not of war, of precedent." Traoré turned to his chief of security and gave one order: "Send the delegation." "But I won't go. Let them face the future without my silence." As the sun set over Ouagadougou that evening, a quiet storm brewed in the corridors of power. In Geneva, Roland Devereux tightened security at his estate and began shredding files. In Washington, policy advisors debated sanctions. In Johannesburg, activists raised funds to build a memorial, not for a war, but for a moment. A turning point. Back at the palace, Traoré removed the military jacket he wore during the announcement. He handed it to a young guard and said, "This was for the fight. But now we lead." The gold was no longer the prize. It was the symbol. Africa had stepped onto the world stage, not with a whisper, but with a roar. Before dawn, Falcon Unit executed its first coordinated maneuver, a quiet freeze of 8 targeted accounts in Switzerland, carried out with the cooperation of a rogue European insider whose identity remained hidden, even from Traoré. The sum, over $1.1 billion in gold-backed assets, all traced back to extraction contracts signed during military regimes and forced development deals. At 5:14 a.m., the first alert hit Brussels. By 5:17, Roland Devereux was on the phone with the European Central Bank. "They've initiated a seizure," he spat, pacing. "Under what authority?" The answer chilled him. "Their own." But that success came at a price. Within hours, Burkina Faso's access to several international financial systems was restricted. Banking apps stopped working. International wire transfers bounced back. Major platforms halted trade with the country, citing security concerns. The West didn't need to send tanks. They had algorithms. In the marketplace of Ouagadougou, panic began to swell. Shopkeepers couldn't pay suppliers. Hospitals waited for vital shipments. Social media buzzed with concern. Had Traoré led them into isolation? Was this the cost of dignity? In private, some ministers began to panic. But Traoré remained composed. "If they cut us off," he said, "they also expose how dependent we were. This is our rebirth." Inside the presidential palace, Awa Diarra convened with the Regional Economic Alliance. Mali and Guinea pledged food and fuel support. Chad sent medical supplies. Even Tanzania offered satellite communication links. It was the birth of something Africa had only dreamed of, a continental safety net built not by foreign banks, but by Africans, for Africans. "They think our strength is our weakness," Awa said. "But unity was always our missing currency." A few analysts began to whisper that this moment was bigger than gold. It was a blueprint, an alternate future, a dare to all colonized nations still licking old wounds. Meanwhile, Devereux launched a counterstrike. He mobilized international law firms to sue Burkina Faso in multiple jurisdictions, labeling the freezes as financial terrorism. He funded media narratives painting Traoré as a dictator, a populist, a threat to global order. Newsrooms in Paris, London, and Washington echoed the claims. But none of it stopped the images coming from Africa. Images of school children singing freedom songs, of villagers digging irrigation canals newly funded by repatriated gold, of flags once trampled now flying tall. The world saw two stories. One of power clinging to its past, and another of a continent writing its future. Just as Burkina Faso braced for further retaliation, a leak emerged from an unexpected source. A former Belgian intelligence analyst turned whistleblower, who released a trove of documents under the alias Imani. The files revealed what no African leader had ever confirmed publicly, that the gold reserves stored in Europe weren't just from Burkina Faso. They included contributions from over 17 African nations, secretly consolidated over decades under a classified post-colonial banking accord known as the Umbra Protocol. Signed in the 1960s, the protocol allowed Western banks to act as custodians of African resources, without expiration dates. The scheme had survived regime changes, civil wars, and even revolutions. And now it was exposed. The implications were seismic. African presidents who had dismissed Traoré as radical suddenly found themselves cornered by their own people. Massive protests erupted in Nairobi, Accra, and Abidjan. Activists demanded transparency, audits, and reparations. If Traoré is a rebel, one protest leader shouted in Lagos, then we all are. The African Union, once hesitant, issued an emergency resolution calling for a continent-wide investigation into all foreign-held assets. Meanwhile, in the West, media narratives began to shift. Journalists unearthed archival footage of colonial treaties and economic conferences where African leaders were bullied into compliance. The truth had rippled through history like a long-hidden crack splitting wide open. Back in Ouagadougou, Awa Diarra stood before a massive digital map showing every bank implicated in the Umbra Protocol. "This isn't just about gold," she said to Traoré. "It's about narrative. About who owns the story of our suffering and our survival." Traoré, seated at the head of the table, leaned forward. "Then let's do what they never did for us. Tell the truth in full view of the world." He instructed his communications team to launch the Sankofa dossier, a live, open-access archive that documented every stolen resource, every signature, and every shipment from Africa to the West since 1957. The archive went viral in 48 hours, translated into 32 languages. In Brussels, Devereux watched helplessly as his empire cracked. The documents were irrefutable, the history undeniable. His lawyers withdrew one by one. European citizens began protesting outside central banks, some even demanding their governments return the gold. For the first time in his career, Devereux realized he was no longer the puppeteer, he was the marionette exposed to the world. He turned off his screens and stared out at the skyline. "I built this world," he whispered, "and they're burning the blueprint." But far from destruction, something else was rising. Not a new war, but a new order, built not on silence, but on justice. The continent awoke. Across Africa, leaders gathered in Addis Ababa for an unprecedented emergency summit of the African Union. For once, the agenda was not dictated by donors or foreign dignitaries, but by Africans themselves. President Ibrahim Traoré arrived to a standing ovation, flanked by youth leaders, elders, and ministers from nearly every nation. In the grand hall where so many sterile resolutions had once been passed and forgotten, he spoke with unfiltered urgency. "This is not about gold. This is about dignity. Our children were born into debt built on our own stolen wealth. No more." His voice cracked the marble air. No translation was needed. The truth echoed in every language. A motion was passed to establish the Pan-African Sovereignty Fund, an initiative aimed at recovering and reinvesting Africa's wealth, not through IMF channels or World Bank programs, but under full continental ownership. Nigeria pledged oil revenue, Kenya, agricultural exports, Ghana, rare earth minerals, Burkina Faso, its recovered gold. It was the first time in recorded history that African nations contributed voluntarily to a joint economic structure not orchestrated by external forces. "We were carved into pieces," said a Malian delegate, "but today we gather not to redraw borders, but to reclaim our foundation." But unity had its enemies. Some nations remained absent from the summit, still beholden to Western contracts and military dependencies. Whispers of political pressure, bribes, and sabotage floated through the corridors. A cyber attack briefly shut down the Sankofa dossier, prompting emergency protocols to decentralize the archive across blockchain servers hosted in South Africa and Rwanda. At home, Traoré received intelligence that a smear campaign was being prepared, linking him falsely to weapons trafficking and destabilization plots. He knew this was part of the pushback, a desperate attempt to fracture the unity that terrified the old powers. Still, the mood had shifted irreversibly. In Dakar, artists unveiled a monument called The Return, depicting an African child handing a gold ingot to an elder. In rural Ethiopia, farmers held a vigil with candles shaped like coins, not to worship money, but to mark the return of honor. In Luanda, school children reenacted Traoré's speech as part of history class. For the first time, the past was no longer a shameful burden. It was a weapon of clarity. Awa Diarra, reviewing the latest polls and media coverage, turned to Traoré and said, "They tried to bury us in silence. But we became a chorus." And the chorus was getting louder. Just when it seemed Africa was finally gaining momentum, the blow came. At midnight, the World Bank and IMF jointly announced the immediate suspension of all financial aid and lending programs to countries participating in the Pan-African Sovereignty Fund. In practical terms, this meant frozen infrastructure projects, halted vaccine deliveries, and withdrawal of food assistance in multiple nations. The message was clear: choose freedom and you'll pay for it. By dawn, Western media spun the crisis into a narrative of economic irresponsibility, warning of imminent collapse. For some, fear returned like a familiar fog. But in Ouagadougou, it ignited something else. Markets faltered. The Burkinabe franc dropped in value. Crowds grew restless. Outside the capital, protests formed, not against Traoré, but in support of him. "Let them take their money," one man shouted through a megaphone in Bobo Dioulasso. "We have our land, our water, and our hands." Yet even as rural solidarity swelled, cracks emerged in the government. 2 senior ministers resigned, citing fear of international isolation. Foreign ambassadors quietly urged their nationals to leave the country. Some military commanders began voicing doubt. "We're losing control," one advisor warned. But Traoré stood unmoved. "We are not losing control," he said. "We are shedding dependence." Awa Diarra, usually composed, grew weary. She hadn't slept in 2 days. "They've cornered us," she told Traoré in a rare moment of vulnerability. "We're running out of food reserves, fuel is being rationed, and if the rains don't come soon," her voice trailed off. Traoré placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you remember Sankara?" he asked. "They said he would fail too. But he planted seeds. So will we." That night, they made a choice. Rather than retreat or beg for aid, they would launch the Rebuild Ourselves plan, a domestic mobilization campaign asking every Burkinabe to contribute, work, and sacrifice in the name of sovereignty. It wasn't about money. It was about belief. But alone in his quarters, even Traoré felt the weight. He looked at an old photo of his mother, a woman who had harvested gold dust with bare hands and sold mangoes to feed him. "What would you say now, Mama?" he whispered. The palace was quiet, save for the hum of distant generators. Outside, the city dimmed under power restrictions, yet one building remained lit, the new National Treasury Vault. Empty for now. But not for long, if hope could hold just a little longer. This was the storm before dawn. And dawn, if it came, would have to be earned. 3 days into the blackout, hope arrived from the skies. A cargo plane emblazoned with the eagle insignia of Mali landed quietly at Ouagadougou International Airport. On board were 12 tons of food, medicine, and fuel, a gift from neighbors who had once struggled alongside Burkina Faso under colonial boots. Minutes later, similar convoys crossed in from Guinea and Niger. The media tried to downplay it, but the people knew, this was Africa feeding Africa. Crowds formed at the airport gates, singing traditional songs as supplies were offloaded. The message was undeniable, no more begging bowls held out to former masters. This time, salvation came from within. Inside the palace, Traoré watched footage of women cooking with donated grains, children cheering as fuel trucks rumbled by, and youth volunteers clearing irrigation paths. "This," he whispered, "is the gold." Awa Diarra burst into the room holding her tablet. "Look at this," she shouted. On screen was a breaking report from Geneva. A tribunal of independent African legal experts had just ruled that the Umbra Protocol violated international norms of sovereignty and restitution. While the ruling lacked direct enforcement, it triggered an avalanche of lawsuits. More than a dozen African nations filed motions to recover assets. Even Western civil rights groups began calling for reparations. The dam had broken. And then came the moment no one expected. In Paris, a group of French students occupied the Ministry of Finance, demanding their government return African gold and declassify colonial-era banking treaties. "We don't want blood gold funding our pensions," one student declared. In Berlin, a coalition of historians and economists published The Continental Theft, a detailed exposé that validated everything Traoré had claimed. Across Europe, guilt turned into solidarity, not universally, but loud enough to shake the halls of power. For the first time, the West began to fracture under the weight of its historical denial. Back in Ouagadougou, the people poured into the streets again, not in protest, but in rebirth. The lights came back on, power grids stabilized, hospitals reopened, and food flowed freely. What had once been Burkina Faso's darkest hour was now its most luminous. In a televised address, Traoré stood beside school children and elders alike. "They tried to starve us," he said, "but we found nourishment in each other. They tried to isolate us, but we became a family. This is no longer about recovery. This is about rebirth." And as his voice rang out across the continent, a truth became clear. Africa had not just reclaimed its gold. It had reclaimed its soul. With momentum restored, Traoré turned his focus toward permanence. "Revolutions fade when they aren't institutionalized," he told his cabinet. "We don't just need symbolic victory, we need systems." Awa Diarra presented a roadmap, a Pan-African digital currency backed by natural resources, a regional development bank headquartered in Bamako, and a gold-backed sovereign fund with voting shares for every contributing nation. It was audacious, complex, and unlike anything Africa had attempted since independence. "This is what they fear," she said, pointing to a slide. "African capital in African hands." The room went silent, not from doubt, but from awe. Preparations moved fast. Legal teams finalized recovery frameworks. Engineers expanded gold storage facilities with multi-layered security protocols. Educators drafted new school curricula that replaced colonial narratives with African history, science, and heroes. In villages across Burkina Faso, elders taught children about the meaning of sovereignty, not as something granted, but something lived. "The chains we break must never be reforged," one griot declared, playing his kora before a captivated crowd. Meanwhile, artists, musicians, and filmmakers across the continent responded with works of passion. Not just about the gold, but about the reawakening of identity. The cultural revolution had begun. But beyond the celebrations, a storm brewed. Intelligence sources warned that foreign contractors were infiltrating allied nations under the guise of humanitarian aid and development agencies. Anonymous threats were issued to Traoré's family. Drone surveillance over Ouagadougou increased. A leaked cable revealed that certain Western states were considering sanctions, targeting regional destabilizers. The term was thinly veiled. Traoré understood the signs. "They're not done," he told Awa. "The empire never leaves quietly." He called for a final assembly, not just of leaders, but of thinkers, farmers, workers, and youth. If they try to undo what we've built, he said, they'll have to face the entire continent. On the eve of the assembly, a full moon bathed the capital in silver. In the palace courtyard, Traoré walked alone among newly planted trees, one for every nation that joined the gold recovery. He paused beside a sapling labeled Congo and ran his fingers over the soil. "May this grow stronger than what was taken," he murmured. Nearby, children rehearsed a song written for the assembly. "Africa shall not bow." Its melody echoed softly through the night, mingling with the wind. The president looked up at the stars, not searching for answers, but for ancestors. They had waited generations for this. And now he would not fail them.